Hello there, fellow internet explorers. Now let's talk about something important, data privacy. You know that stuff we all think about right before we just click I accept on another user agreement. Well, that's where Incogni comes in to save the day. Picture this, every year thousands of data brokers are collecting, selling, and trading your personal information like Pokemon cards, except you don't want them to catch them all. Your name, address, even your online habits, they're out there for somebody to see. But the good news is that you can take back control of your data and it doesn't have to be a huge effort. Incogni, with just 3 steps, handle all of the heavy lifting. First, you create an account and you let them know what data to remove. Next, grant them the power to work on your behalf, and boom, they go work on your behalf as you relax and they tackle those data brokers for you, requesting removal of your personal data and handling any objections from those brokers. Plus, I got a great deal for you. If you use the code SHADOWS at incogni.com/shadows, you'll get a whopping 60% off an annual plan. So, you could take back your personal data with Incogni because your privacy deserves to be protected. Big thank you to Incogni for sponsoring today's video, and now let's get into it. With approximately 27 deaths for every 100,000 employees, working on an oil rig is around 7 times deadlier than the average profession. The oil and gas industry is subject to a variety of strict regulations for both environmental and safety reasons, but these regulations can only do so much. The truth is that working with highly pressurized and flammable products while out at sea, far away from any medical facility, has some associated hazards that are simply inescapable. Furthermore, human and mechanical error can combine with these hazards to generate a dangerous situation in very little time. Now, you've likely heard of the 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster, when an explosion at the Deepwater Horizon oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico off the United States' southern coast claimed 11 lives and caused the worst oil spill in history. However, there was another oil rig disaster that took place over 20 years earlier and claimed many more lives. This is the story of the Piper Alpha oil rig disaster, when multiple developing hazards aligned and gave rise to a catastrophic event that shaped the future regulatory landscape of oil drilling. In 1972, 4 major petroleum companies formed a joint venture named Occidental Petroleum Caledonia Limited. The joint venture then obtained a license to search for oil reserves in the North Sea off the east coast of Scotland by mapping the seafloor. Within a year, they had successfully found what they were looking for. Occidental identified a 30.1 square kilometre, or 11.5 square mile region at the bottom of the North Sea which was rich in oil. Work began immediately to prepare for exploiting this resource by constructing an oil rig that would be connected to a network of other platforms located in nearby oil fields. Piper Alpha was the name given to this platform, which would pump oil from 36 wells in the Piper oil field. It was placed approximately 190 kilometres, 120 miles off the coast of Scotland, in 144 metres of water, that's 472 feet. The structure was supported by 24 piles that extended another 116 metres into the seafloor, 380 feet. The oil processing facilities of the rig were divided into 4 modules, modules A to D, which were each separated by a firewall. The processes performed within these modules included a variety of dangerous steps involving heavy machinery and extreme pressures. To reduce the risk posed to the crew by these processes, the modules were deliberately placed as far away as possible from areas frequented by personnel. Construction of Piper Alpha was completed in 1976. Following this completion, the rig became the hub of a network incorporating platforms located in 2 other nearby oil fields. Oil from all 3 of these oil fields would then be piped to Flotta Oil Terminal in the Orkney Islands, where it would then be processed further. When it commenced its operations, Piper Alpha alone was producing 250,000 barrels of oil each day. This later increased to a staggering 360,000 barrels or 15.1 million gallons of oil every day. Underground oil reserves often coexist with gas deposits called associated petroleum gas. At the time, Piper Alpha was designed to simply burn this gas off as it was collected, a process called gas flaring. However, with the addition of some extra equipment, this associated gas could be collected and processed into natural gas. A gas conservation module was added to Piper Alpha in 1978 to perform this task. The gas removed from the seafloor would be processed and pressurized by the new equipment before being transferred by a pipeline to a nearby natural gas production facility. Due to the retrofitting required to place this new equipment, some of the natural gas processing facilities were located near areas of the platform that were frequently occupied by personnel. This was a deviation from the original safety plan implemented when constructing Piper Alpha. Natural gas production on Piper Alpha could be toggled on and off. When the gas was being flared instead of being collected for processing, Piper Alpha was said to have been operating in Phase 1 mode. Meanwhile, the rig was said to be operating in Phase 2 mode when the gas was being processed. 10 years later, in 1988, Piper Alpha was scheduled to undergo a major overhaul that would include 6 projects. One of these projects involved replacing parts of the natural gas processing equipment. At the time that these projects were being performed, Piper Alpha's oil production had decreased by 50% to around 125,000 barrels of oil each day, which was still enough to make it the world's single largest producer of crude oil at the time. Now, as we begin to discuss the disaster that took place on Piper Alpha, it's worth mentioning that this is the most agreed upon recollection of events. Many have attempted to produce an accurate account of the events that unfolded, but components of these stories are sometimes disputed by survivors or other investigators. The sheer destruction and devastation that took place on July the 6th, 1988 would make it impossible to gather some evidence necessary to know for certain what happened. So, we mentioned earlier that Piper Alpha contained 4 modules that housed the necessary equipment for oil and gas production. The problems that would give rise to this disaster began in one of these modules, Module C. Piper Alpha's Module C contained 2 pumps that were used for collecting associated gas, intuitively designated Pump A and Pump B. Pump A was scheduled to undergo regular maintenance, including removal and recertification of its pressure safety valve, as well as an overhaul of the pump's inner mechanical components. A total of 2 permits were completed for this work, 1 for each task. Work on Pump A began on the 6th of July with the removal of its pressure safety valve. To facilitate this work, the employee responsible for completing the task placed a blockage upstream in the pipe responsible for feeding condensed gas to Pump A. The worker was unable to complete the pressure safety valve replacement by the end of their shift at 6 p.m. They therefore did not remove the blockage that they'd placed upstream of Pump A. The worker noted on the pressure safety valve work permit that Pump A was not to be used under any circumstances because of the blocked pipe and removed pressure safety valve. Importantly, no note of this work was made on the second permit that had been completed for the mechanical overhaul of Pump A. The employee who had been working on Pump A was unable to inform the operator in charge of Piper Alpha's evening shift of the pump's inoperable state during the shift change. Instead, the employee simply left the pressure valve safety permit with the necessary information in the control room for the head operator to find. All signs indicate that this permit was never seen by the evening shift. At 9:45 p.m., Pump B stopped working, and efforts to restart it proved unsuccessful. Workers were under pressure to maintain production levels and therefore wanted to restart pumping operations as quickly as possible. Upon continued failure to restart Pump B, the workers decided to consider starting Pump A. The mechanical overhaul permit for Pump A was retrieved and reviewed, and the decision was made to restart Pump A since there was no indication of the ongoing work on this permit. Now, we know that the crew did not see the pressure safety valve permit, indicating that Pump A was inoperable. However, we don't know exactly why. There are 2 theories concerning why only one of the permits was referenced before restarting Pump A. One theory suggests that the pressure safety valve permit had been misplaced by the worker who had been working on Pump A as they were finishing their shift. The other theory suggests that the standard protocol for permit organization in Piper Alpha's control room would have resulted in the permits being housed far away from each other. If this was the case, then the evening shift might have only thought to reference the first permit that they found, which was not the permit that indicated the ongoing work. Now, regardless of the reason why, condensed gas flow was redirected to Pump A at around 10 p.m. The blockage placed upstream of the pump quickly failed, allowing pressurized gas to reach the inoperable pump. Within a matter of seconds, the hissing of this gas escaping was noticed by workers. Gas alarms began to sound, and the gas ignited, causing a massive explosion. Since Piper Alpha had originally been constructed solely for oil production, regulatory standards did not require the rig's firewalls to be blast-proof. The explosion destroyed Module C's firewalls, the nearby control room, and large portions of the other module. A large pipe containing oil was also burst during the blast, leading to a secondary fire following the ignition of its contents. Piper Alpha was built with multiple safety measures to counter the risks of an onboard emergency. However, none of these systems had been designed with an explosion in mind. First, Piper Alpha's control room included an emergency stop button, which was designed to immediately cease all gas and oil production. Remarkably, a control room operator who survived the blast was able to reach and activate this button. Unfortunately, this measure failed to put an end to the disaster, likely because of the extensive damage sustained by the safety equipment during the explosion.
Piper Alpha contained an electrical fire suppression system. However, electricity was lost in the rig following the explosion, preventing the system from activating. The rig also contained an alarm and announcement system designed to alert all onboard crew members of emergencies, but this system was also damaged by the explosion and rendered inoperable. At this point, the fate of Piper Alpha was dependent on its final line of defense: diesel-powered pumps that were designed to automatically detect widespread fires and douse the entire rig in water pumped from the sea. Unfortunately, this failsafe would also not save Piper Alpha from further disaster. Divers had recently been performing routine maintenance around the oil rig, and it was standard practice for the fire suppression pumps to be switched from automatic to manual operation. This was done to reduce the risk of an accidental activation, resulting in a diver being sucked into the pump's water intake. Some workers had recently raised concerns with this practice, expressing that the risk of a diver being caught in the pumps was minimal. Indeed, the practice of turning the pumps to manual mode had been discontinued on nearby oil rigs because of the serious safety risk that was posed by doing so. Since these pumps were not set to automatically activate at the time of the Piper Alpha explosion and fire, they never turned on. Furthermore, the damage resulting from the explosion prevented any workers from reaching the pump's controls to manually activate them. At 10:06 p.m., the situation on Piper Alpha went from terrible to catastrophic. Another pipe carrying crude oil in Module B ruptured, releasing vast quantities of oil that subsequently ignited. The burning oil spread throughout the oil rig and dripped down to a platform below that was primarily used by divers. The burning oil pooled on this platform, and noxious smoke rising from it shrouded the entire rig, making it difficult to see and breathe. At around 10:20 p.m., 70 to 80 surviving crew members had gathered in the rig's gallery to frantically assess the best course of action. Access to the helideck and the lifeboats had been cut off by the explosion damage. While they tried to make their plans, the situation continued to worsen. The intense heat and severe damage caused another gas line to rupture, leading to a high-pressure gas fire. Over the next hour, 2 more gas lines would rupture and ignite, making Piper Alpha hell on earth. The flames from the gas rose 300 feet into the air, and heat from the fires could be felt over half a mile away. Crew members were met with a grim choice: shelter in the rig at the mercy of the intense fires, or take their chances jumping into the sea. Piper Alpha's structural integrity started to fail by 11:45 p.m. as pieces of it began to collapse into the sea. First, a crane fell, followed shortly by the drilling deck and Module D, still containing crew members who were sheltering in place. An hour later, at 12:45 a.m. on July 7th, only Module A of Piper Alpha remained above the water. At 10:23 p.m., a message from Piper Alpha was received by a nearby semi-submersible rescue craft that had been stationed in the North Sea, specifically to respond to emergencies, called Tharos. The message that it received from Piper Alpha was: "People majority in galley area, Tharos come, gangway, hoses, getting bad." Tharos dispatched its Sikorsky S-76 rescue helicopter, but the intense heat and dense smoke of the fire prevented the craft from getting close enough to Piper Alpha to assist with the rescue effort. Tharos itself reached Piper Alpha by 10:30 and engaged its water cannons to battle the raging inferno. These efforts were successful in clearing a path for the crew that were stuck in the galley to reach the helipad. Despite continuous efforts, Tharos was unsuccessful in extending its gateway to provide a path for the Piper Alpha crew to escape the rig. As the structure of Piper Alpha continued to become less stable and fail, Tharos was forced to pull back from the scene. The crew of Tharos then established an emergency response medical triage unit on the helipad to treat the victims as they were rescued. Multiple other vessels were close enough to Piper Alpha to observe signs of the ongoing disaster. Several of these ships dispatched their own rescue craft to assist with the ongoing efforts. These craft raced towards the scene to save as many Piper Alpha crew members as possible from the intense flames as the rig continued to collapse into the sea. 2 men from other vessels were killed when their rescue craft got entangled in debris from Piper Alpha and was consumed by flames. Other nearby vessels used their own fire control systems to spray seawater on the burning rig. Collectively, between 40 and 50 Piper Alpha crew members were rescued by these craft. In addition to the seaborne response, a fleet of aircraft were dispatched from the mainland to assist with rescue efforts. A Hawker Siddeley Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft arrived to serve as an airborne communications platform. 5 WS-61 Sea King rescue helicopters also arrived to assist. They rescued workers from the sea, delivered them to Tharos to be medically triaged, and transported those in need of additional care back to Aberdeen, Scotland. The last survivors were rescued from the water at 7:25 a.m. the following day. Aircraft continued to unsuccessfully perform sweeps in search of additional survivors until the late afternoon. When the chaos of the disaster calmed, 165 of the 226 crew members on board Piper Alpha were either dead are unaccounted for. The 2 additional fatalities occurring on the rescue craft brought the total death toll of the disaster to 167. When Module D was removed from the seafloor several months later, 87 missing men were still found inside. 30 workers were never found. Efforts to remediate the effects of the disaster would take years. 9 months afterwards, what remained of the rig was dismantled and disposed of in the sea. Oil production in the North Sea would not reach levels seen before the disaster for another 6 years because of investigations, additional safety inspections, and the damage sustained by the infrastructure. In all, the tragedy would be one of the most expensive man-made disasters in human history, with an estimated cost of about $8 billion. The Piper Alpha disaster was followed up by detailed investigations and legal proceedings that identified both engineering and regulatory causes leading to the tragic events. These inquiries were complicated by the absolute destruction of most of the rig, along with the fact that most of the surviving evidence was located on the sea floor. Investigations would determine that multiple contributing factors gave rise to the disaster. One factor was the concentration of multiple safety features in a relatively small area near where the initial explosion took place. This design flaw disrupted access to evacuation routes and destroyed emergency communication and response systems. Another factor was the addition of the natural gas processing facility. The retrofitting of this equipment exposed the rig to risks that were not considered during the initial construction of the platform. It also disrupted the intended isolation of the crew facilities from hazardous procedures. The investigation would also determine that Piper Alpha's operator, Occidental, should be held responsible because of their negligent management of safety procedures on the rig. However, criminal charges were never brought against Occidental, and the total of $200 million that was set aside to compensate the families of the victims was provided by Occidental's insurance company. The report resulting from the legal proceedings on the Piper Alpha disaster made a total of 106 recommendations concerning a broad variety of topics. They included personnel management, equipment design, and emergency response protocols. This report would eventually lead to the passing of the UK Offshore Safety Act of 1992. It would also lead to the transferring of responsibility for safety on oil rigs from the UK Department of Energy to the Health and Safety Executive. So the Piper Alpha disaster is one of the most deadly and expensive disasters to have ever taken place in the natural resources exploitation industry. Occidental didn't know it at the time, but when they upgraded the Piper Alpha oil rig to process natural gas in addition to oil, they had set this rig and its crew on a collision course with disaster. In addition to the absolute chaos and the lost lives, the historical significance of this event is evident in the impact that it had on the regulatory future of this industry around the world. The report that followed the Piper Alpha disaster investigation inspired UK policy changes related to the handling of maintenance paperwork, oil rig contract management, structural and functional updates of oil infrastructure, and standard maintenance. Many of these changes were also adopted by other governments and continue to affect how oil is collected today. However, despite these regulatory changes, human error is an unavoidable risk. This became apparent in 2010, when a similar combination of mistakes and lack of safety culture gave rise to the Deepwater Horizon disaster. This disaster resulted in 11 deaths and caused an environmental catastrophe by releasing 134 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. The Piper Alpha oil rig was replaceable. Its successor, Piper Bravo, stands in the North Sea today, pumping oil from the sea floor about 400 feet from the location where Piper Alpha stood. What is not replaceable are the 167 lives that were lost on July the 6th, 1988. Will a disaster like this happen again? It's difficult to say. A report in 2020 determined that cases of minor spill and accidents on offshore oil and gas collection rigs are on the rise, which could be evidence of a troubling trend in a lack of attention to oil rig safety and regulation. However, only time will tell if this means that another Deepwater Horizon or another Piper Alpha could be in our future.